This week on BRSTV, we find out that corals really grow faster at a higher pH. Hey, this is Ryan, your host of BRSTV. Reefers have been chasing pH for as long as I've been in the hobby. This week we put that to the test and then share our results on a scale of reef certainty to reef fantasy. Real quick, big thanks to Vertex for providing the A/B test tanks, Neptune for providing the controllers, dosers, and water change systems, Aquatic for the Radion lighting and diffusers, and of course our friends at Worldwide Corals. It's one thing to offer useful products and corals to reefers, a whole other thing to invest in helping reefers find success, hopefully setting a new standard of what you can expect. If you get a chance, please thank them so they can keep saying yes to more of these experiments. Getting to it, the reason elevated pH matters to so many reefers is because in theory, a higher pH should result in both higher growth and lower mortality. There's no shortage of research articles on the effects of ocean acidification on coral reefs, many of them sharing the change from as little as 8.2 to 8.1, having major impacts on coral growth, larval survivability, and the overall health of the reef. As reefers, we can obviously maintain a reef tank as low as 7.8, but I think the question we all want to know is there legit benefits to maintaining higher levels near the 8.2 to 8.3 range in a reef tank environment. For what it's worth, there's clear science as to why we should see additional growth with a pH around 8.3 and something likely nearly universally agreed upon by the marine biologists of the world. This is the most basic representation of why that is. Within the coral's tissue, it's predominantly combining bicarbonate alkalinity and calcium ions to create a calcium carbonate skeleton and grow. To allow for the precipitation of bicarbonate and calcium like that, the coral has to maintain a fairly high pH within its own tissue. This is where the challenge comes in. The byproduct of that combination of bicarbonate and calcium is the release of a hydrogen. That hydrogen now contributes to the acidification of the fluid within the coral, and the coral needs to get rid of that hydrogen to continue growing. More or less, it just pumps the excess hydrogen through the tissue back into the surrounding tank water. For those of you that don't know, pH is actually just a measurement of the amount of hydrogens in the water, and each pH point, say from 7 to 8, represents 10 times as many hydrogen. So this is where the pH story comes together in terms of coral growth and metabolic health. At a pH 8.3, there are relatively few free hydrogens in the water, meaning it's easy for the coral to free itself of the excess hydrogen. However, if we drop the pH from 8.3 to 7.8, there'll now be 5 times as many hydrogen in the surrounding water, which makes it much more difficult for the coral to overcome the pressure of freeing itself of that unwanted hydrogen. If the coral cannot free itself of that hydrogen, then the fluid inside the coral becomes acidic, and the growth can either slow down or even potentially stop until it can free itself of the hydrogen and increase its internal pH. So when we increase the pH from 7.8 to 8.3, there are 5 times fewer hydrogens. The coral theoretically is capable of growing much faster. I say theoretically, but this is generally agreed upon science, and the only real question here is what real impact will be on the reef tank. Does that mean that the difference is even measurable? 10% more growth, 20, 50, or double? And that's what the BRSTV Investigates here today is all about, the real results, and is the juice worth the squeeze? To test this, we use our side-by-side Vertex A/B testing tanks, 2 of them running at a stable 7.8, 24 hours a day. This is achieved by injecting small amounts of CO2 into the skimmer with an electric solenoid and our Apex controller. The added CO2 simulates the same effect of people and pets breathing in a closed room, which is a direct cause of lower pHs in most reef tanks. And the other set of Vertex A/B test tanks, we're running them at 8.3, and in this case, doing the opposite by scrubbing the CO2 out of the air, feeding the skimmer with CO2 absorbing media. This simulates a well-ventilated room with limited CO2 accumulation. We then added 2 examples of 10 different types of coral to all 4 tanks, weighed them, and we'll be measuring the growth via weights at the end of the experiment. You'll note that we do have redundant test tanks here, and that's simply because the results are much more compelling if they're repeated. There are just too many variables in a reef tank to look at just one set of tanks. So in that spirit, rather than treat them as a combined experiment, we're going to treat them as 2 separate experiments with tank 1 versus 3 and 2 versus 4. So let's get to the results. The first thing I want to point out is without weighing any of them, I can tell you already I strongly believe there is a difference just because the alkalinity dose required to maintain our target of 9 DKH for the higher 8.3 tanks was pretty consistently near 30 milliliters a day, and the dose for the 2 lower pH tanks was near 15. Alkalinity consumption is one of the best tools reefers have to measure the successes of what they're doing. It can often give immediate feedback if the changes that you're making are producing desirable results. Related to that, we ran into an issue with one of these tanks with some undesirable algae growth, which irritated the corals and slowed growth. As soon as the algae took hold, you could see the alkalinity consumption actually drop. I'm going to share the experiment which didn't have the algae interference first with tank 2, high pH at 8.3, and tank 4, which had the lower pH. We started the experiment on February 1st and ended it on May 1st, which was 3 months of growth. In the high pH tank 2, all 25 corals grew from a total of 362 grams to 467, which is a 105 gram or 29% increase in growth by weight. With the low pH tank 4, the total weight of all 25 corals started at 363 grams and grew to 443 grams, which is 80 grams or a 22% increase in growth. The net result of that is the high pH tank grew 32% faster than the low pH tank by weight, but I gotta say visually, it's pretty obvious as well. Visually, many of these corals grew faster, and you can actually look at these two corals and see the growth with the naked eye. You can also see where many of the corals in the high pH tank also based out in the plug much faster, just obvious visual cues that the corals are growing faster in a more optimal environment. Again, this isn't surprising because it matches what basically every marine biologist would expect, but does assign some actual expectations to it as well. The one thing I note here, the results are also very likely exponential. So the 29% of continued growth scales over time, and the net result after a year of 29% quarterly growth would be 290 grams. Meanwhile, the scaled 22% growth will only achieve 177 grams in a year, meaning in this experiment, it's likely many of the corals will actually double in size in that time. I will note that not every coral grew faster, but with the combined growth of each coral type, 8 of the 10 high pH corals showed positive growth over the low pH tank. Okay, what about the second experiment with the same parameters? I'd call this a failed experiment because an external factor with algae significantly affected the results. Just like any newly set up tank, managing pest algae in these brand new tanks can be difficult, particularly because common cleanup crew options of snails and crabs are not very effective on egg crate. Regardless, I'll share the results. All the way into March, we see the same 30 milliliters or so of daily alkalinity consumption in the high pH tank 1 versus the 10 to 12 milliliters in the low pH tank of 3. However, that's when the algae sets in and it started to irritate the coral in the high pH tanks. At that point, the alkalinity uptake became about the same. Looking at the end growth rates, the high pH tank started at 363 and grew to 428, which is 65 grams of growth. The low pH tank started at 353 grams and ended at 419 after 3 months, and a basically identical 66 grams of growth. In the end, considering the high pH tank had to fight all that new tank pest algae, I think producing the same result is actually impressive. Also, watching the alkalinity consumption differences prior to the algae issue, I think there's a strong indication that this experiment would have actually replicated the other if we had not ran into that issue. Okay, so ranking this one today on a scale of reef fantasy to reef certainty, I'd call this one an 8, and the experiment showed what the science suggests, but also gave a window into what to actually expect in a reef tank environment. For reefers who have pH issues, I think this turned out to be a valuable data point as they attempt to understand if the juice is really worth that squeeze when trying to elevate their pH. The most common methods being refugiums, better ventilation in your home, high pH 2 parts like those based on soda ash, using kalkwasser for calcium and alkalinity, and of course, what we actually did here with a CO2 scrubber feeding the air into your protein skimmer. So when you consider how long it takes for those little frags to become colonies, in some cases, I think there's potential here to grow the tank out in nearly half the time and probably valuable to a lot of reefers. So that's exactly what's next. We're gonna set up 2 of these Red Sea all-in-one E170s that they provided us for these experiments with nearly identical rock formations and coral placement, and then grow them out over a year or 2 so reefers can get an idea of the real results from their efforts. We're also going to do something unique by attempting to recirculate the air through our CO2 scrubber and skimmer, meaning rather than continuously drawing fresh air from the surrounding room, we're actually going to draw air from the top of the skimmer cup, feed it into the scrubber, and then back into the skimmer itself, essentially creating a recirculating design. This is an idea I found on Reef to Reef. The reefers there are always drumming up some of the best ideas for our hobby. Basically, doing it this way, you can dramatically extend the life of the CO2 media and reduce the cost of implementation. If this works as hoped, I think it represents a legit, affordable way for most reefers to manage the pH of their tanks more effectively. When combined with other high growth options like those we've explored previously in other BRSTV Investigates with elevated parameters, it really begs the question on if we can turbocharge growth in our tanks. In fact, it might be worthwhile to get a quick refresher on how those elevated levels went with the video over here, because we have a new update that's coming out super soon on that. See you next Friday with another BRSTV Investigates.